Hi, this is Tom Needham, and welcome to the Sounds Podcast. Today, we're very fortunate to have on the program Amy Wax, a professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania Carey Law School. Before her academic tenure, she served as an assistant to the Solicitor General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where she argued 15 cases before the Supreme Court. Dr. Wax's educational background is notably diverse. She earned a BS in molecular biophysics and biochemistry from Yale University. She was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University. She earned an MD from Harvard Medical School and a JD from Columbia Law School. Her career spans both medicine and law and includes practicing neurology and later transitioning to legal scholarship. Today, we're going to be talking about some of these accomplishments and also review some of her controversial comments about race, gender, and immigration. Amy, thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so man, you have a remarkable past. Can you just tell us a little bit about your journey throughout education and all the schools you attended? I'm so fascinated by it.
Well, it's not that remarkable. I'm hardly the only person who has obtained both a law and medical degree. There are hundreds of people in that category. Many of them start out in law and go to medicine. I did the opposite. I think my journey to medicine really started because I was very interested in and good at science and math as a high school and college student. And I didn't think much about it. My parents were very thrilled with that choice, and so I pursued it. But when I went to med school, I realized it didn't really fit my temperament or my interests that well. I ended up going to Harvard Law School for a year and then got married and transferred to Columbia, which was an excellent law school, and got a very good clerkship. Went to the Justice Department, which was a wonderful job where I learned a tremendous amount, and then decided I wanted to teach law. So I began my legal teaching career at the University of Virginia Law School. That was back in the 90s, and then transferred to Penn. So it was not that unusual career trajectory. I am glad that I trained in medicine. I learned a lot. And I've drawn on my scientific training in general in my legal work. So having a background in science with the rigor of that, the emphasis on evidence, on quantification, on precision, all of that is very helpful and very important, especially since there's been a sort of drift away from that,
Hmm.
which is regrettable. So to have that as an anchor has meant a lot to me.
Yeah, that's really impressive. You mentioned the University of Pennsylvania. Obviously, a lot of people may have heard that you've been involved in a bit of a situation there. Can you, and just in your own words, just briefly tell us what happened in recent years at the University of Pennsylvania?
Well, it's sort of a convoluted story, but I'll try to summarize it very briefly. I wrote a number of pieces, op-eds. Actually, a lot of it is online interviews and podcasts that people at my university objected to, found offensive, upsetting, and the like. And especially what stands out, although it's not the only thing, was my criticism on Glenn Lowry's podcast. Glenn Lowry is an economist who teaches at Brown University and has a series of podcasts that are rather widely listened to. I made a criticism of my school's affirmative action policy and noted that Black students struggle at my school because they are underqualified relative to other students. So it stands to reason that they would have trouble competing. And they tend to fall into the bottom of the class or even the bottom of the bottom. And I made a sort of general statement based on my experience over, teaching 20 years at the school. And this evoked the ire of my dean and a number of other people. they put together a dossier about me and all the horrible things that I had said. And then at the end, they tacked on a handful of accusations that I abused students or demeaned students or said things in class, which frankly were a sign of desperation on their part. I mean, the stuff they accused me of, I can go into detail, but they were ridiculous. A number were just fabricated. In any event, charges were brought against me. There was a hearing by an academic panel. They went through procedures, and at the end, they found me guilty of major behavioral violations. It was all very vague, even though what they were accusing me of is speech, which is supposed to be protected and is protected under the faculty handbook, longstanding traditions of academic freedom, other documents that are widely accepted. They didn't care. They were oblivious to it. And they suspended me for a year. My suspension has not begun yet because I was in the middle of teaching when they did this, and they didn't want to disrupt my classes, and cut my pay in half for a year and said I could never get any more research funds. So it was a pretty big financial hit that they imposed on me. And of course, the suspension, I have no idea what that means. They've never done that before. And now I am suing them. Now I am involved in a court case. So I'm in the middle of that. And one of my charges against them, which is really important, is that they disciplined me and punished me because I criticized, sacred minorities, disadvantaged minorities who get special treatment in the academy today, frankly. Whereas there were other people at the university who said very anti-Israeli, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic things in the wake of October 7th, and they were never disciplined. The school said, no, they're protected by academic freedom, academic free expression. They refused to recognize my right to academic free expression. And I am accusing them effectively of a double standard of race discrimination against Jews. They don't protect Jews against adverse criticisms, but they do protect Blacks. So that is a double standard, and I think it is illegal.
I appreciate you sharing your side of the story. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, just in a general sense today, is this idea of academic freedom. And as you mentioned, sometimes people on the left, sometimes people on the right at the collegiate level will complain when they feel like their academic freedom is being challenged, and that's been in the news a lot recently with your case, and then also again with certain activities that have been going on related to Israel. Can we just go through? I mean, you know this better than anyone. Some of the legal, things that one should understand when it comes to academic freedom in general. A lot of people think that professors can say whatever they want. How true is that exactly?
Well, I mean, obviously there are limits to what professors can say, right? So when I am invoking my own academic freedom, I am implicitly saying that I did not reach the limits. I was well within the area of protection. I think the first thing to understand about academic freedom is that it's complicated. I think it should be simpler than people make it out to be. But it isn't that straightforward. The first divide, the first distinction that needs to be made here is between public universities and private universities. Public universities, because they're sponsored by the government and the state, they have to abide by the First Amendment and adhere to First Amendment principles. And the Supreme Court has been, pretty good about articulating what those are. They have a very wide ambit, a very wide berth. So professors at public universities can take advantage of that. Now, that doesn't mean they can go into their classrooms and rant about the latest, issue. There are pedagogically defined limits that really are a matter of what their job description entails, right? I mean, if you're supposed to teach calculus, you go in there and talk about calculus, you don't talk about how awful Trump is. Or whatever. So, there are these kind of sensible limits, which are based on the fact that you're an employee. And the Supreme Court has recognized that, right? When people are government employees, there are certain restrictions that apply to them. So that's public universities. Now, I am employed by a private university, and private universities have a ton more legal leeway to punish and restrict their members' speech because they are not subject to First Amendment limitations. Now, things get dicey because some universities have voluntarily taken on First Amendment obligations, and my university is one such. Liz McGill, who is now the deposed president of Penn, said under oath to Congress after October 7th, when she was called in for hearings, well, we abide by the First Amendment. We honor the First Amendment here. So I have that commitment to fall back on. Now, in addition to that, there are policy statements that have been made by the American Association of University Professors. There's something called the Woodward Report. There are these kind of informal documents that lay out the lineaments of academic freedom. And one important distinction that those documents make, and this is actually incorporated into my handbook, my university handbook, is between so-called extramural statements, that is, statements that professors make in public fora, in podcasts, in the press, etc., versus what you say to students in class in the university. And professors have pretty much unlimited ambit, as all citizens do, for pronouncements in public. Okay, in fact, they have more freedom than ordinary employees do. That's sort of a complicated piece of doctrine, but that's because of the special obligations of professors to pursue the truth and express themselves, right? So I actually, if we respect all those limits, I have quite a bit of leeway in what I can say. Now, those limits are quite capacious, but my school ignored them in prosecuting me. The sorts of things that they object to my saying are really statements of public policy, statements on public issues that are, commonplace out there in the real world. The problem is they're conservative, quote unquote, opinions and viewpoints that are startling within the academy that nobody dares to express in the academy. Why? Because the academy is completely captured by far left forces, professors, administrators, academic brass, the presidents, the provosts. These people are almost uniformly politically far left, and they impose this code, this sort of woke code of correct opinion on everybody, including students. So, statements that would not be startling in a Midwestern living room that people talk about all the time are effectively off limits in the academy. That is what I've learned by what has happened to me.
Can you clarify when we're talking about academic freedom for someone who's listening, who's not involved in university life or anything like that? People just know that they have freedom of speech, the First Amendment. How is an average person who doesn't work at a university different from someone who's a professor? You already explained the difference between someone who is a professor at a private university versus a public university. But how is the First Amendment different for professors versus someone who just works in a factory or works at the post office, or is every case different?
Well, they're actually pretty similar. As I said, the Supreme Court has gestured. They haven't really squarely decided this. The law is a little bit complex here. Supreme Court has gestured to giving more freedom to professors because it is their job to explore ideas. Okay, so both on the job and off the job, they're given a wide ambit. For ordinary private citizens, they too are given a wide ambit in outside of the workplace, right? In sort of if they went on a podcast or they participated in a demonstration or got up on a soapbox, in a park and gave a speech. Can their employer fire them for that? Can their employer punish them for that? Well, and once again, I'm simplifying the law here a little bit, which is not completely nailed down. Their employer uh, technically can, right? But pretty much the courts have recognized that it has to be tied to um, their employment function.
Mm.
Okay, so the employer does, if the employer, let's say, is a company like Silicon Valley type company that takes certain positions on tariffs or on the value of their product, and somebody goes off and badmouths their product, obviously, private employers have the right to fire them. And in fact, technically, some courts recognize the right to fire employees for no reason or any reason, because there is something called employment at will. So private employers have a lot of power to let their employees go for any reason. Now, the courts are kind of a little ambivalent about this, but by and large, they have a lot of power. So just to take an example, James Damore, who worked for Google, and this was something he said in a chat room on the job. So it's a little different from going out there and giving a speech, at an unrelated event. But he said he thought that women were particularly unsuited to doing some of the jobs at Google, computer-related jobs. They weren't as good as men, and he backed it up with all sorts of material and research and stuff. And what he said was, I didn't object to it, but a lot of people at Google did, and he ended up being fired. So he was effectively fired for his political opinions. And Google said, well, this affects the atmosphere in the workplace. If we have someone there who thinks that women aren't as good as certain jobs as men, that will be demoralizing to the women at Google. So we can't keep this guy on. So, a lot of people think that ordinary citizens have full First Amendment rights vis-a-vis private employers, but actually they don't.
Yeah.
They don't. So bottom line here, and once again, the law is not completely nailed down, and there are whole books about this. In fact, there are two that have recently been published. I would recommend Keith Whittington. Keith Whittington is a scholar at Yale who's very, very expert in these matters, and I really respect his work. I don't agree 100% with everything he says, but I respect his work. I think his new book is called something like You Can't Say That, or something along those lines. Anyway, if you Google his name, you will find it. And there's another book by a guy named Raban about academic freedom, which is also very valuable and kind of goes into the intricacies of this. I think if I had to give a bottom line, I would say that professors who work for private universities, by virtue of commitments that these universities have actually made, stuff like embracing the First Amendment and things they say in their faculty handbooks and internal documents and signing on to free expression statements that have been made periodically by committees of professors, they accord their professors greater rights than ordinary citizens and employees of, non-academic institutions have. I would say that is a valid generalization.
I think this is fairly obvious, but I wanted to ask your thoughts about tenure. as it relates to this. I was a teacher, and tenure was always something that the public would bring up. Some were for it, some were against it. But why is tenure important for professors, or don't you think it is?
Well, tenure has been under attack, interestingly, recently. Tenure just gets knocked every once in a while. I do know people on the right, friends of mine, who think, well, if we could just get rid of tenure, we could get rid of these far, far lefty professors and these faculty that are stacked with far, far lefty professors, right? Because tenure gives them protection and power. I think that's an oversimplification. Now, let me just say that tenure has helped me. I am an exception to the rule. I'm a conservative professor, which is very rare in elite academia these days. There are very few of us. And I think that in my case, I would have been instantly fired for a number of the things that I said if I had not had tenure. I think that tenure was a major speed bump in my own case. So I was not fired. But that's an exceptional case. What would happen if we got rid of tenure, right? Well, it's hard to say. Who would make the decisions? Who would decide whether a given professor could stay on? Would those decisions be insulated from politics or partisanship? I can't imagine that.
Mm.
I mean, as long as other professors are deciding which professors will continue to be employed, the far left will have control over the process. Now, I guess right wingers imagine that, certainly in the case of public universities, state legislatures or state authorities will become those with oversight, right? And they might get rid of some of these lefties. They might try to bring in people with more moderate views or right-wing views. Well, first they have to find them, okay, which is not easy in academia because they get screened out all along the way. And if the tables are turned, right, if the Democrats or progressive Democrats come back into power, they'll turn around and fire the conservative professors. I mean, getting rid of tenure is not a way to insulate the process from partisanship. I don't think it's a way to make the process better.
Yeah.
Because there are too many unknowns. So my bottom line on tenure is, we should keep it. That's not the source of the problem. The source of the problem is self-governance, that these institutions are closed systems that govern themselves and perpetuate themselves. And they've been captured by the far left. There's no easy path to introducing more balance into academia that doesn't run up against First Amendment and free expression limitations. So I will just lay my cards on the table. I do not think Trump or state legislatures should be passing legislation that tells universities you can't teach critical race theory. You can't teach about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that when federal or state money is being used to support institutions, there can be terms of you can't have diversity statement requirements, or you can't use race to select students or faculty. I think those limitations are valid because they go to how the university is run and enforcing the civil rights laws, which are, by the way, violated every day of the week by these universities. But in terms of what professors can teach and what they can say, I would really be hands off on that. The way to create more balance and more of a spectrum is to, I think, start by creating sort of centers within the university that are dedicated to Western civilization or to constitutional principles. Try and bring in people to balance the opinions that are already there, not try and silence the voices of the people who are there. That is not, to me, a method that comports with free expression and First Amendment values. So, we do have those limits, and those limits are positive. They're salutary. And the reason I say that is because, I'm a conservative professor, and I ask, is it good for conservatives? Every time somebody proposes a rule, I say, well, how could this reduce protections for conservatives? If it does, I'm not in favor of it.
Mm. One of the things that I think sometimes restricts professors' speech is that it's not maybe the university at first telling them what they can say or not say,
Mm-hmm.
but that there are students who are very sensitive, and
Yes.
that's been a
Mm.
growing issue. There's a term that I've heard you use before called the heckler's veto. Can you explain
Right,
what that term is?
right. Well, the heckler's veto is an idea that the Supreme Court has recognized in First Amendment jurisprudence. And the Supreme Court has said, in order to protect First Amendment rights, one thing that we cannot do and not allow to be done is for those who are offended or upset or who object to particular viewpoints or speech to be allowed to veto that speech or punish it or shut it down, because that would be the heckler's veto. That is, the sort of soapbox analogy. If someone gets up on a soapbox and gives a speech and people in the audience shout it down, they're hecklers. Shut up,
Hmm.
get him off the soapbox. That's a heckler. And when the heckler succeeds, that's a veto. Supreme Court says no heckler's veto is allowed when people are exercising their First Amendment rights if they have protected First Amendment rights. So what we've seen in the university is a complete disregard of that principle, a complete rejection of that principle. Uh, how has that worked? You alluded to it. The students claim that they are upset, they are offended, they are traumatized. I call it traumatology, psychologically disturbed by what someone has said. And ergo, that person must be silenced, censored, canceled, punished, or deplatformed, not allowed to speak. And this is a very common and routine ploy that has been used on campus in the woke era. And what the administrators and professors ought to do is say, I'm sorry you're offended, I'm sorry you're upset, but you cannot shut down a speaker or a viewpoint or an opinion because of that. That doesn't count. Well, they've done the opposite. They've said, oh, if the students are upset or offended, that is a reason to cancel a speaker. And they've got this whole elaborate structure that they've built. Oh, it prevents the students from being able to learn. They feel excluded. They feel like they don't belong. There's this whole vocabulary and terminology that backs up the heckler's veto. And they subjectivize this notion of harm. They've got a whole structure that they've built around this to justify it. And of course, I just think the whole thing is horribly misguided and destructive. But there it is. So that has to be dismantled. That has to be repudiated. And it does start with the students, but the students are enabled. They are permitted to get their way in these matters. And it is the authorities in the university who grant the permission, the administrators, the leadership, the professoriate. Without their permission and their enabling of the heckler's veto,
Hmm.
it wouldn't happen.
Can I ask you, at the lower level, like in elementary schools, for example, sometimes
Mm-hmm.
the argument comes from the right that they're teaching certain things in the public schools that maybe are offensive to the parents. They don't want their kids
Hmm.
learning a certain thing. In other words, their kids will become a victim of whatever the ideology is of, the teacher in the classroom or the school. Um, is that different? And if so, how? In
And I
terms of
think it
what
is
was going
totally
on?
different.
Yeah. So why is that
Mhm.
different?
I think it is totally different. And I think it is really important to draw a sharp distinction. There's a lot of confusion in this area. It's complicated, right? A sharp distinction. Oh, let's just put it on the table between children and adults. When you're talking about K through 12, you're talking about children. And it gets a little murkier in the upper levels of high school, but frankly, I think we can have a bright line rule here. Whereas when we proceed to universities, we are talking about adults, right? So let's talk about children. Children are not equipped to assess and evaluate the broad spectrum of ideas and viewpoints. They simply do not have the maturity, the intellectual equipment to do that. Uh, they're not at a stage where that's viable, and we have a long tradition in Western societies of understanding that. So children are really, they are not the creatures of the state. Their parents have primary responsibility over them to bring them along, develop them, educate them, and decide what is age appropriate. At what age should they be exposed to certain materials, to certain ideas, to certain concepts, and also to ensure that their basic educational development is taken care of in the proper way. And of course, we relegate to the schools that job to do that. Okay. Now let's talk about sexuality, because a lot of these controversies have surrounded um, sexual subjects and exposures. Not all of them, because there are others having to do with hot button issues like race and multiculturalism and the like. But let's put those aside. I mean, sexuality is moralized in every society. You cannot separate, you cannot be neutral about sexuality and teach it in a neutral way. It is almost impossible to do that, except in the most basic elements of information. Okay. So that is relegated traditionally to private life. Parents were long recognized until recently as primarily in charge of how to introduce their children to sexuality and sexual behavior, when to do it, right? In what manner to do it, uh, what is right and what is wrong, what is proper conduct and improper conduct in that area. And, I go back to when I was in elementary school in the 60s, in the 50s. I mean, everybody knew without even speaking of it that sex did not belong in the schools, right? If someone asked about these intimate matters, ask their teacher, the teacher would say, ask your parents. So this stuff just was not taught at all. Now, there's contingent of society that says, oh, that's backwards, that's benighted, we need sex education. Well, I actually don't think we need sex education. And a lot of people I knew didn't think so. And we got the basics, the 3 R's. That's what we were in school for, right? Now, what is the battleground? Parents who want to maintain that authority that they have traditionally had over the moral development of their children in the area of sexuality. And frankly, I think that the system should bend over backwards to preserve parents' authority in this area. Schools should have a much smaller wheelhouse, a much smaller charge and ambit, and recognize that smaller charge and ambit. And because they've expanded what they think to be their purview to sexuality, everything having to do with gender, gender identity, identity in general, all of these controversial issues, as a result of that expansion, they have neglected the basics. So, there's a kind of inverse relationship between all of this junk that has been piled into K through 12 education and the school's ability to discharge its primary goal, which is to develop basic skills.
One of the things
Um,
that's confusing, I think, is what is the goal these days? And
right.
not everyone would agree. People have different views about some of the subjects that you mentioned that are being taught and whether they should or should not. But one thing that's definitely been happening is that schools have put less emphasis on testing in recent years. Even the
Yes.
colleges for a while were dropping the usage of the SATs, which people can very easily question the validity of the SAT. But I noticed a lot of the Ivy League schools are bringing it back as something to consider when taking in students. But the whole issue of merit in terms of um, ranking kids in terms of their academic success is becoming something of the past. A lot of schools now don't even rank the students. What is going on with this kind of stuff when it comes to merit and testing and ranking and all that kind of stuff?
Right. Well, that trend has definitely occurred. But I think if you really were to burrow down to the source of it all, right, I think it goes back to the problem that different students and especially different groups are not equal in their achievements. There is this desperate attempt, which is ongoing and longstanding, to try to close gaps in ability and achievement and success that exist in our society between rich and poor, between black and white, different groups. And now, of course, it's all gotten very complicated with all the immigrant groups that have come in. Uh, and I think that gets mixed up with this ideology, this left wing ideology that we are all blank slates, that the structures in society and our experiences are what make us what we are. We don't come along with any innate abilities. Some people more innate abilities than others. That's something that people don't really want to accept. They certainly resist it. So when you put this all together, right, then you're really shooting the messenger and blaming the messenger when you get rid of tests. Tests show that there are differences in the abilities that make for success in society between individuals and even between groups. Sort of this big elephant in the room is the black-white test score gap, which has existed for a very long time and still exists and has barely narrowed despite all of our efforts to narrow those gaps. So when the last ditch method is to just get rid of the measures that show those gaps, right? Which kind of makes no sense. Or cast doubt on this whole idea of merit. That one person is, better at something than another, or more proficient than another. Of course, it's highly selective because we still honor those concepts in the context of sports and the like. But when it comes to intellectual ability, we sidestep them and denigrate them. So it's really this mania for equality or for equity, I think, that is driving the attacks on the meritocracy. And the attacks on the meritocracy are coming from everywhere. Once again, the left controls education schools, the left controls the education establishment, and they are the ones who have extreme doubts about the meritocracy, so they get their way.
We mentioned some of the major universities that you've attended and worked at. Um, I guess they are all elite colleges traditionally.
Right.
What is the role of these colleges, in your opinion? I mean, should they only be accepting the best of the best in whatever subject matter they give degrees in, or should it be about bringing other groups in? But even there, if it's still an elite university, like what would be even the purpose of that? What's the concept of
Right.
an elite university in terms of its function in a country?
Well, I have to tell you, it's amazing that we've had a university system for a very long time in this country, and we've not really sorted all that out. I was talking to a group last night of professors, and when they were talking about SATs and achievement gaps and all the usual stuff, how should we select our freshman class? What is the role of diversity? What kind of diversity? And I said, we really need to step back and try to answer these questions and ask ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish in the university? What are universities for? And that is not an easy question to answer. I really have to tell you. But here's my sort of first take on it. We have a hierarchy of institutions of higher education in this country. We have an elite sector, and then we have I'll do a lot of lumping here, a non-elite sector where anybody can pretty much waltz in, or almost anybody, more or less selective schools. And I've been, pretty much at selective places my whole life. And here I do truly believe that selective schools should focus on educating the best and the brightest. And that's why I think affirmative action, at least for these very elite schools, is a mistake, or it's been overdone. Right? Let me give you an example that's a little more concrete. Okay. Penn Med, which is an elite medical school, one of the top handful, maybe, certainly in the top 10, right? They have a very aggressive affirmative action program for Blacks. Now, in the wake of the Trump administration, they're kind of, hiding it. They had something called the PASS program. They would allow students who graduated from historically Black colleges who can maintain a 3.5 average, which these days isn't that hard, okay, because of great inflation. They would allow them to bypass the medical college admission test. They didn't even have to take it, as long as they did a summer program, which is one of these, who knows how rigorous the summer program is. And they would be admitted to Penn Med. Now, in my opinion, Penn Med should not have such a program, right? In effect, they're educating barefoot doctors. Now, I'm not saying there might not be other institutions where they might have more relaxed standards. I am not sure about that, and I'm not endorsing that, but I'm saying that's a separate issue. But a top med school that is training our future medical scientists, that is going to be responsible for the United States maintaining its cutting edge position in medical therapies, medical science, medical progress, and that is the position that our country currently occupies, right? They should be taking the very best people. And I don't care if that group is not quote unquote diverse. Diversity is overrated. It's a cult, right? It's never proven that it really produces any benefits. We just have to take it on faith that it produces benefits. But unless those benefits are demonstrated, I'm not interested. I want the very, very smartest people, because I'll tell you something. In order to make progress in a very challenging and complex field like medicine or medical science or therapeutics, you need the very smartest people. We are talking about the right tail of the bell curve, the right tail of the right tail. And if there are few or no Blacks over there, then that's just the way it is, right? We can talk about why that is. We can try to address it. But the way to address it is not to dumb down admissions at our most elite technical universities, certainly not when we talk about science and the like.
Well,
So that's just one piece of it, right? I mean, that leaves a lot undecided, but I think that is the way to analyze it.
you mentioned before that most people at these elite universities are liberal, in fact, and they just disagree. Um,
Right.
you
I
know,
know.
so
I know.
so
They're wrong, I think, but
but most of
what
them
can I do?
disagree, and I'm not taking either side here, but I'm sure they would argue that there is virtue in it, and that it can lead to bringing on more people from different communities, and with the proper instruction, they can do it, and they believe that it is something that lots of different people are capable, and they have examples of people who have succeeded and it's worked. Um, what's wrong with opening the door and trying to right a situation that was wrong for many years when you look back at discrimination and injustice and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I mean, just to go back to my medical example, and of course, the principles that you're articulating are much broader than that. They apply, different fields, undergraduates, et cetera, right? But we just look at medicine. Notice that you use the word people believe. They believe this, they believe that. They believe this is beneficial. Where's the proof? My husband, Dr. Roger Cohen, is an oncologist and a professor at Penn Med, and I are about to publish a fairly extensive essay as part of a volume, The War on Science, it's called. And what we ask in that essay is, where's the evidence? Where are the studies of the outcomes of these affirmative action programs? What happens to the people who are admitted? Right? Do they pass their subsequent exams? Do they jump through all the hoops? And there are many hoops to jump through on the path to being a doctor, and especially being an elite doctor. Do they contribute to science? Are they successful? How many patients do they treat? Where are the patients? Do they pass their board exams? Let's study this intervention the way we study medical interventions, the way we do clinical trials. Let's see the results. And I can tell you that so far, and we go through the literature on this, and we've talked to people involved in diversity, inclusion, and equity programs. There are none. They're not studying them. They're not looking at the outcomes. So I just don't think we should be asked to take all this on faith. That's what makes it a cult, right? The cult of diversity. We don't need to prove anything. We don't need to study the results and the outcomes. We don't need to show you that this is ultimately beneficial and a successful way of going about things.
You have had you
And I just don't accept that.
Yeah, you've had a very successful career, and you really could have done so many different things and just had a stress-free life in terms of not having to deal with a lot of the reactions that you're probably receiving right now. I know some of our listeners' heads are blowing up right now. But I have to ask you, like, when you have the option of not saying, some of the things that you're saying, um, what compels you to go to these topics when it's going to upset people, and you know there's going to be a backlash? Um, it would just be easier for you. What is it about trying to get to the truth of some of these things that is so important to you?
Well, I mean, you talk about stress. To me, nothing is more stressful than going along with ideas, viewpoints, or factual premises that I think are false based on what I know. Nothing could be more stressful than that. Now, the poet A.E. Housman said, "The love of truth is the faintest of human passions. But for me, that is not true. The love of truth is a bright and burning passion for me. I need to get to the bottom of things. And I've kind of always been that way.
Mm.
I mean, it's important, I think, in an academic to be that way.
Yeah.
Excuse me, because I have a little cough here. But the loss of that love of truth is very threatening, not just to academia, but to our democracy, to our civilization. We have succeeded. We in Western society, I'm going to broaden it to post-Enlightenment Western society, because we have elevated the pursuit of truth to a very honored and important position. And that is key. It's absolutely critical to our success, to our prosperity, to our stability, to our, and I'm going to use the word, superiority as a culture and a way of life. And if we lose that, we will lose a lot. And I see us losing it. You know, every society has its taboos and its dogmas. It's a matter of degree. But, you know, our degree of substituting dogma for curiosity, pursuit of truth, perception of truth, and the like, has been, that balance, I think, has been very positive. And I'd hate to see us lose it. And, you know, you say, well, stress-free life. There is no stress-free life. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
There are privileged lives. I consider my life very privileged, very fortunate. And I consider my opportunity to pursue what I believe to be right, despite its costs. And there are costs.
Yeah.
I consider that a privilege. One of my favorite writers has a wonderful quote, a writer who is not well known, James Stephen. He wrote a book. He was a 19th century conservative jurist. He wrote a book called Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, a wonderful book where he actually criticized John Stuart Mill and some of his ideas. But he has this passage where he says, and he was a very conservative guy, he was not a revolutionary. He said, if you go up against the spirit of your age, which may sometimes be necessary, he didn't think it was always necessary, may sometimes be necessary, do not be surprised that you are opposed as a soldier entering the breach, right? Bring a sword. And that's why they call it a culture war.
Mm.
Because in a culture war, people get hurt. People are not going to just say, oh, okay, we're going to give up our position, you know, our beliefs, our privileges. The people in university are not going to give up their power. They're going to fight. And so I can't be surprised that I am being fought.
Well, Amy, I'm not sure that I agree with everything that you've said, but one of the things that I respect about you, and this is true of a lot of guests that I have on the program, is I respect people who do fight for what they believe in, even at a cost. And I do support freedom of speech, even when I don't always agree with everything that everyone says. So I want to thank you for coming on the program and telling your side of the story and sharing your views on these topics. I hope that we can speak again. Do you have any website or any place you want to direct people online so that they can learn more about your work if they're interested?
Well, I deliberately don't have much of an online presence, but if anybody Googles me, it will take them to my articles, my podcasts, my interviews, and the like. So I'm very easy to find. But I do want to say one thing in response to your closing remarks, which is you said, well, I support freedom of speech, although I certainly don't agree with everyone's ideas. Well, that is something that goes with the territory. I think people need to be far more accepting and tolerant. And I mean, grudgingly tolerant. You don't have to love it. You don't have to embrace people who disagree with you, but you have to tolerate them and try and get along with them. Lincoln has a wonderful quote where he says of the Confederates and his fellow countrymen just before the Civil War, he says, we must not be enemies. We are friends. We are fellow citizens, and we must all be friends. And really what he meant by that is we have to resist punishing and persecuting people we disagree with. If we don't resist that, we will become like the rest of the world, right? Where dissent is squelched, and you can see the results. The results are not pretty. So that is what I would advise the audience. Restrain yourself, hold your nose, but we are not your enemy.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.